Hi everybody, and sorry. Thanks, Michael, and good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our for tonight's hustings. Tonight's general election hustings. So my name is Adrian Carroll, and I work as senior policy officer with AsIAm. It's a pleasure to join this evening to highlight our policy achievements from 2024, and to share some more details about our key asks outlined in our general election manifesto. So 2024 has been a productive year for AsIAm as we worked closely with government departments, state agencies, and the wider community and voluntary sector. Some key examples of our work across the year has include working with the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth on producing Ireland's first autism innovation strategy, which ensured key actions from the strategy form part of our community, are reflected in our community's priorities. Um, Working with the Department of Social Protection on the Work and Access Scheme, and in highlighting the impact of means testing disability payments such as carers allowance and domiciliary care allowance has on our community. Engaging with the Department of Education and the National Council for Special Education on draft guidelines to regulate the uses of seclusion and restraint in schools. And we also could conduct a research on the use and impact of codes behavior in schools, bringing attention to how these policies affect autistic students and their school and their everyday school experiences. So we now just move over to our general election manifesto. So over the past few months, AsIAm has been engaging with political parties in the run-up to the general election. We recently launched our general election manifesto, which focuses on actions that we believe will bring Ireland towards a more equal, inclusive, and accessible society for autistic people and families on a range of key areas that we will be discussing this evening. To provide context, through our engagement with our community, we are too aware of the many barriers which remain to accessing vital services and supports. We know too well that being denied access to essential services, such as the right to go to school in your local community, to key supports such as speech and language therapy and occupational therapy, and autism assessments have a real impact on how people on on people giving on people on people's quality of life, and we see all too often that our community are being denied the same chance in these areas. So many people and families experience the lack of appropriate and accessible school places, with many families having to wait months before a suitable school place becomes available, and only for these places to be located far away from their local community. We are particularly alarmed that within our education system, harmful practices such as seclusion and restraint are commonplace. We urge the next government to introduce and publish child-centred, robust and human rights compliant guidelines which regulate these practices. We also see the stark impact that poverty and social exclusion has on our community's well-being, with autistic people being particularly likely to experience unemployment or underemployment, lack of access to supports to live independently in the community, such as personal assistance or personalised budgets, and to mental health services and supports. This year's St. Chance report revealed the stark reality of this exclusion and underinvestment, with many sharing their experiences of loneliness, stigma, and lack of understanding, which shape how they experience living in Irish society today. So our manifesto is built on three pillars. The first, towards inclusive education. In our manifesto, we call on the next government to ensure that every autistic person has the same chance to access a suitable school place in their community by implementing statutory child-centred and rights-based guidelines to regulate seclusion and restraint. For planning future school places where families don't have to fight for places every summer, smaller class sizes, that school deliver therapies for autistic children when they need these supports, and to make changes to the Action Act which align with best practices in inclusive education under United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Under the pillar of towards better supports, we call on the next government for increased investment to deliver timely, joined up and where needed autism specific services which support our community and break the cycle of exclusion and disadvantage that our community that autistic people and families face. These actions include benchmarking disability payments to keep up with wage growth and inflation, ending means testing for disability social protection payments, and increased investment in our public services, including better mental health services, um, um, which include the recruitment of clinical staff in our health services, rolling out more one-stop shops across Ireland and more AAC devices to improve supports in our community so that autistic people can access the supports they need in their locality when they need it. And our final pillar is towards a holistic approach, where we call on the next government to deliver actions which act on Ireland's obligations under the UN CRPD and support autistic people to have the same chance. We want to legislate for and act on delivering a national autism strategy, to reform the Disability Act to fully align with the UN CRPD, for the next government to act on all 109 recommendations on the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Autism final report, making sure that we have enough clinical staff within the HSE to deliver the necessary supports at the point of need, and to have all the resources needed to deliver these services, and to co-create, and for our community to be active participants and to be involved in shaping and co-creating future policies and actions that that support our autistic people and our wider community to have the same chance to belong, to feel accepted and included in our society. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Adrian, and for setting out AsIAM's key priorities for the next programme for government. I'm going to hand you over now to our good colleagues in Inclusion Ireland and to hand you over to Derval.
Thank you, Michael. Wonderful to be here with you this evening, and thank you to all of the deputies and party representatives who've taken the time to be with us this evening and to hear from our members and our community about the very real issues facing people and their hopes for the new programme for government and what we can achieve together as we work towards a more inclusive society. Tomás, would you like to come off mute and just introduce yourself as well? I'm joined by my colleague, Tomás Murphy.
Yes, I will. Thanks, Derval. My name is Tomás Murphy. I'm one of 4 staff advocates with an intellectual disability on the board of directors of Inclusion Ireland. I'm co-chairperson of the Include subcommittee to the board of Inclusion Ireland. I work 2 days a week for A&L Goodbody Solicitors, and I'm also on the Accessibility Committee as well. So my name is Tomás.
Thank you,
And back to
Tomás.
Derval.
So just for people who don't know a lot about Inclusion Ireland, we're the national advocacy organisation for people with an intellectual disability. We've been in existence for about 60 years, and we've been at the forefront of the disability rights movement during that time. Our main focus is and remains and will continue to remain the realisation of people's rights under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And what we know from speaking to our members and our community is that there are many barriers facing children and adults with intellectual disabilities and their families that we are hopeful the new government can start to make more progress on. Our manifesto itself calls for long-term thinking, not short-term fixes. What our community tells us every day is that band-aid fixes do not work, and we need to be thinking long-term about removing some of the real structural and systemic barriers that is leading to people living in conditions that are unacceptable in 2024. We're calling for the new government to have a focus on legislative change and also real planning for people's lives and real action in communities across Ireland. So just to highlight 3 key areas in our manifesto this evening, in line with the questions that we'll be putting to the deputies and party representatives this evening. So number 1 is around inclusive education. We know that many of the children that we support, children with intellectual disabilities at Inclusion Ireland, are facing immense barriers in accessing what should be a basic right under the Constitution of a high quality education in their local community. Children that we know are travelling for up to an hour and a half every day to access that most basic of rights. And it is often, and we see repeatedly in the media year on year, a scramble for school places, something that should not be a fight that any family member has to take on. We also know that many children, and we have similar experience to AsIAm in terms of reaching out to our communities, the children that we know are also experiencing restraint in schools, seclusion, and practices that are simply not rights compliant and are causing untold damage in the early years in a child's life. So we know that there's a lot to be worked on in the education system, and we have called specifically for, as a first port of call, a citizens' assembly on education, session to really spell out what is our hope, what is our dream for the future model of education in Ireland, and how can we collectively work towards that, where all children get to go to their local school with the support that they need to thrive and flourish. And some of the children that we support need significant amount of support to access their right to education, but it should still be their right to go to school and get that support like every other child. So that's our first protocol, is around education and a citizens' assembly. And we've also called for a strategic plan, because we know that it's going to take time to build a more inclusive model of education. So we need a real strategic plan with money and resources, multi-annual funding year on year, to incrementally make a change in the education experience for all children. Our second major priority in our manifesto is around housing. And when we speak about housing, we're talking about it in the broadest sense of the word. So we're talking about it in line with Article 19 of the UN CRPD, which is the right to live in your own community with the supports that you need to do so. For some of our members, that is about staying living with your family, and families need support to be able to do that. So that's about building in home support. It's about building in personal assistance. It's about looking at personalised budgets so that people who want to and choose to can stay living together, but have the support from the state to do so, and that we don't wait for a crisis to intervene. We support people early in ways that people want to be supported so that they can stay living in their own home. And then for other individuals who want to move out of the family home and into a home of their own, that should also be a right, and there should be a pathway that is clearly defined, that people can move out of their family home with the support that they need to do so. So again, some of our members might need a small amount of support to do that, such as some personal assistance hours or some home support, and some of our members might need a lot of wraparound supports to make that happen and to make that a reality. But it should still be the person's human right to be able to achieve that goal of a home of your own. So we've called for an increase in personal assistance hours, an increase in home support hours, more access system-wide to personalised budgets, and more housing and supported living for people. And what we hear from our members is that they are waiting for crisis to happen, and that simply isn't good enough, and we need to see change in that regard. We know that there's 1,500 people living with family carers who are over the age of 70, and they ask us, the people themselves ask us the questions: what is going to happen when my carer passes away, when my parent passes away? What is the plan for me and my life? And similarly, we family members reaching out to us with that very similar question. So it's clear that there needs to be a systemic plan put in place to address those issues. The third area to draw our attention to in our manifesto is around the area of the cost of disability. We know that disabled people are 4 times more likely to live in poverty than their non-disabled peers. We have called for a raise in social welfare payments to above the poverty threshold. And we've also called for a government to implement the cost of disability report and have a cost of disability payment for every disabled person in Ireland, to address the very real barrier of the additional costs that people are facing. So that is us in summary. We're looking forward to hearing from the panelists this evening and to putting some very specific questions from our community to you about your plans in the next programme for government, and as we work together towards a more inclusive Ireland. Thank you.
Thanks, Dervil, and thanks for setting out and Tomas, Inclusion Ireland's key policies. And you'll see from both Adrian and ourselves, there's a lot of alignment there between the key asks from both our organisations. So the next part of the session, we're going to invite our representatives from each of the parties to set out their key policies on the topics that we're speaking of tonight. And our first speaker is Deputy Michael Moynihan. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. As a public representative and as a parent as well, I speak to you. You know, our manifesto has set out a number of key issues in relation to, I suppose, the concerns that people have in the disability sector, and also some of the information that we have got from the public meetings that we've had as a the Disability Matters Committee, and also in the group that was formed within the party on disability and how to best to bring up policy that would have real meaningful change. Now, I can go through the outlines of what we want to do, but maybe if I could just talk really from what I see are the challenges that are faced by people with disabilities, their families, their carers, and their community. And I think there's a number of issues. In your presentation there, he spoke about school, he spoke about housing, and he spoke about cost of disability. But I think there are a number of challenges, particularly for people with autism. And that's at the very early stages, from the child preschool, and then on to primary school, then on to second level school, and right across the country, primary schools have stepped up to the plate in relation to having integration and having units built with the primary schools. Second level schools haven't done that. And there's a huge issue in relation to kids who are leaving primary schools and going on to second level education. And we work with them right across our constituency to try and give the best possible. Then school leavers, and on to day services, and and I suppose a holistic society. And I think if we can go back to the very basics of disability, and we haven't really challenged, the UNCRPD and the optional protocol are put in place. And I think the Disability Matters committee across all parties, which met on a weekly basis, certainly shone a light on the underfunding, the culture, and the attitude that is there from within the state services to people with disabilities, and maybe the attitude that's there in the wider society as well to people with disabilities. And I think that there's a line which says, where when they have a shelter and they're fed, a medical model of providing for people with disabilities, which was heretofore right across not just Ireland, but right across the developed world. And we have to move that to a social care model. And it's over 80 years ago since Maslow wrote the theory, the pyramid of needs. And 80 years on, we're nowhere near even achieving on that. So I think there's a number of issues, review the primary medical cert, when people are accessing state supports like medical cards or disability, and this constant looking for information, whether, looking for to be provided with the same information every 2 years, can be quite challenging. But I think that we need to, in the next census, which is in 2027, we need to refine and redesign that to get more information from Irish society as the challenges that are there. As I said, on the education side of it, I would take it at 4 different levels on it: access to therapies, access to assessment of needs. And then that comes back to having people working within the disability sector, the recruitment and retention, to ensure that people, that are working within the disability sector and providing fantastic services to people with disabilities, that they're valued within society and they're acknowledged for the huge work that they do. I think that, over the last while, there has been a spotlight shone on disabilities and the challenge that are being faced, but we're only scratching the surface, because I see families every day of the week, and the challenges that they have. And I would have to say that some people that are working within the state services, when they're asked to provide support for families, you would think it is out of their mother's pension they were giving the money. That culture and attitude has to change. And politically, all of us have to call it out.
Thanks, Deputy Moynihan, for setting out Fianna Fáil's position, and also the issues that you're hearing in your own constituency as you engage with community members. I'm going to now hand you over to Deputy Mark O'Costigan from the Green Party. So, Mark, you have 4 minutes also.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure when Senator Carrigy joins, we'll insert him back into the queue alphabetically. I want to thank in the first instance AsIAm and Inclusion Ireland for putting this webinar together. I think it's very valuable for us to get an opportunity to speak through our manifestos. I want to thank AsIAm for the ongoing support that they gave to members of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on autism in terms of I suppose helping us understand a lot of the issues, but also to give us the confidence to navigate the issues without feeling like we were going to be out of our depth. They were a constant resource to us. And I think that the report produced by that committee under Micheál Carrigy as the chair is one of the most important pieces of work that was produced in the 33rd Dáil. And I'd very much hope that those 109 recommendations that were produced by our committee will act as a roadmap going forward in terms of how we progress, how we deal with people with autism within our society. I want to speak about a couple of the specific issues that we have in our manifesto, and I will start with education. That's my own background, and it's where my own interest in autism actually came from. I was a primary school teacher before I entered into politics, and had to taught a number of classrooms where we had autistic people within the classroom. I'd be better able to support those students now, I think, with the benefit of all of the things that I've learned on the Joint Oireachtas Committee. But what I would say at the outset, with regards to seclusion and restraint, there's no educator who enters into the profession who wishes to use seclusion and restraint as a tool. What that speaks to is people who haven't been adequately trained and people who haven't been adequately resourced, because nobody who enters the teaching profession enters the teaching profession in order to use those type of tools. So we need to make sure that we have adequate and appropriate school places for everybody with a disability and for all children in general. And it should be provided within the community. So whether we're talking about special school places, whether we're talking about SEN classrooms or autism classrooms, or whether we're talking about supports for students who are within the mainstream, for each child, that's going to be different. I think one of the things that really stuck with me was when Adam Harris came into us as a committee and he said, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. There's not one fit for everything. We should be making sure that we have the appropriate school places for every student, be that autism, disability, or just the regular run-of-the-mill child should also be able to get their appropriate education within their own community. We've committed within our manifesto for better planning around ASD classrooms. We've committed to a review of the Education for Persons with Special Education Needs Act of 2004. We agree with Derval. We call in the manifesto for a citizens' assembly on education. I was disappointed that that wasn't done in the lifetime of this government. It's something that we in the Green Party had pushed very hard for, and we have to pay very close attention to the types of modules that we want included in that citizens' assembly. And certainly, I think special education has to be front and centre in the work of that. To turn to housing, we've committed in the manifesto to support and fund approved housing bodies that provide tailored housing solutions to people with disabilities. The market will not provide these units, be that sheltered accommodations or things that housing units that are designed according to universal design principles. We can't rely on the market to provide these. We have to adequately fund approved housing bodies and give them a specific remit to do that. If we want to invest in supported living, then we also need to invest in the supported services. It's not just the actual physical accommodation. We have to make sure that the services, the wraparound services are there if that's the appropriate setting for the person involved. Derval outlined very clearly that that won't be appropriate for everybody. But certainly within my community here in Tramore and even in wider Waterford, I couldn't really point you to supported living. I can't point my constituents to supported living solutions that I would like to see within my own community. On social protection, and I was the Green Party's spokesperson for social protection in the last Dáil, we talk about a home carers tax credit for people who choose to do caring within the home, to increase that to €4,000 and to open it to unmarried but cohabiting parents. We talk about prioritising increases to the disability allowance, and I think it's very important, and this was referred to earlier, we have to be indexing and benchmarking those payments. I don't think it's appropriate to talk about this at every budgetary cycle, to talk about a €10 increase or a €15 increase. We should benchmark these and make sure that people's spending power within the economy is retained and not have a year-to-year argument about should group X get benefit Y. one of the really interesting things in our manifesto that I would love to progress if we get as far as program for government negotiations is a non-means tested basic income for all carers. We have seen the basic income for artists rolled out under Minister Catherine Martin. In fact, it acts more like a basic income guarantee than a basic income. I think we should really be looking at that for carers as well. It's been proven in the pilot scheme for artists that it's not that costly and that it really has had huge benefits for the people who've benefited within the artistic community. I think we should apply that to carers as well, and I think it would make a huge difference to those people who
Thanks,
seek the care.
Mark. You're just over 4 minutes there, but we'll certainly come back to in the questions and answers around the restraint and seclusion piece as we put to the panel. But thanks for setting at the Green Party's stall. Our next speaker, who I'm going to invite, is Cathal McCann, who's the political director of the Labour Party. So, Cathal, same with everybody else. You've got 4 minutes.
Thank you, Michael. My colleague Mark Wall, who sat on the Special Workers Committee on Autism, sends his apologies. He was already committed to another hustings, and our education spokesperson, Erin O'Riordan, until the election, was travelling back from Brussels. So thanks very much for accommodating me to represent the Labour Party. My own family is on an assessment journey at the moment with one of our children, so it's a process that we're getting to grips with in terms of the education system. We have published a standalone disability manifesto that covers in detail a lot of these issues. So for the people listening at home, it's on our website. We've published accessible versions of all our documents in terms of synthetic audio, plain English and easy read summaries. It's something we have a party section, Labour Disability, that we work with very closely on our policy developments. So just to touch briefly, I suppose, to give a summary of some of the Labour Party positions. In terms of on education, instead of a citizens' assembly, we're proposing something slightly different, a national convention on education. So it will include a citizens' assembly, but also ensure that the voices of children and young people and stakeholders are included. And it's something Niamh Bratnock held just over 30 years ago, the first national convention. And out of that, we've seen major reforms in other areas of education, like additional needs. The DESH scheme grew out of that and other areas. So, and obviously what we say is a central module of that has to look at the right to education and how we address access to local schools. We've proposed an autism guarantee to secure an appropriate place and a fully inclusive model of education that vindicates the right to education for children across the range of disabilities. But we do recognise, and I think Michael touched on it there, in terms of the data that is available, in terms of the planning is just not good enough in terms of how we do that. One of the things we're also proposing is the co-location of childcare, of early education settings with schools, and we think that could lead to a much better long-term planning in terms of what class places or what supports will be needed. In particular, we want to expand obviously the access inclusion model, but we have existing early intervention classes for children with autism that we think could be integrated with a public model of childcare, but also then lead to that better integration. We obviously we outline in our manifesto obviously additional policies around expanding the education therapy support service, the resource allocation model in particular, in terms of how complex needs is identified, the capital funding. So this all comes back to demographic planning, data collection, assessment, and ensuring then that every child is guaranteed a place. The work of the Special Committee on Autism, the recommendations are fundamental to this. You know, the things like the autism audit, the continuous professional development training that's required. I'll just skip on then to in terms of independent living. So obviously a key thing obviously is access routes from education into employment and broader society. We do propose ring fencing up to 10% of social and affordable housing for people with disabilities, looking at the capital assistance scheme to ensure that the sufficient and appropriate housing is built, that it is built to universal design standards. Obviously decongregation, and then in terms of the supports that are there. So in terms of the disability the plan, the disability capacity planning, the plans in terms of whether it's for children disability network teams, personal assistance hours, home support, that we would look to immediately review the allocations that are there for 2025 to ensure that they're appropriate, looking at expanding that independent living model to ensure people can fully integrate within society. And then in terms of social protection, a key thing is looking at the reform of disability payments, which was rightly abandoned. But what we would like to see is reforming it into a single payment, a non-mean tested payment, but that would be taxable, that essentially would remove a lot of the barriers that are there, for example, to employment, that you remove that income disregard so that people maintain their supports, that there would be discretionary medical cards appropriate to medical need, and then obviously a cost of disability payment. We would commit to that within our first budget. So I can touch on the other issues later.
Yeah, thanks, Cathal. Thanks for setting out the Labour Party's policy pieces on this topic. Our next representative is Pauline Tully of Sinn Féin. Pauline.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for the invitation to participate this evening. So good evening to everybody. My name is Pauline Tully and I'm the Sinn Féin spokesperson on disability and carers. I'm a former teacher and I was the SEN coordinator in a large second level school. I was member of both the Disability Matters Committee and the Autism Committee in the 33rd Dáil. So I believe I contributed positively on both committees. I robustly challenged the powers that be, whether that was government ministers, government departments or agencies responsible for the delivery of supports and services for disabled and autistic people. The Committee on Autism has presented its final report to the Dáil in June of 2023, which contained 109 recommendations, and Sinn Féin has committed in its general election manifesto to working towards the implementation of these recommendations, and we also commit to implementing the Autism Innovation Strategy and developing further policies that support neurodiversity. The Committee on Disability Matters during its term produced 17 reports spanning a variety of different areas in which we must achieve, what we must achieve to align supports and services with the UNCRPD. However, while these reports are vital in steering the direction of change that is necessary, real delivery of rights requires investments in supports and services. So I've therefore, as Sinn Féin spokesperson, disability and carers, been working with all my colleagues in Sinn Féin across all portfolios to put together a comprehensive general election manifesto that reflects and addresses the needs of disabled and autistic people. And this includes measures in education to ensure that children with additional educational needs get the services they need and deserve. So this comprises providing a reduction to the pupil-teacher ratio with a focus on the most overcrowded classrooms, providing the NCSE with the greater powers to ensure that sufficient school places and classes are provided and the needs of children are met in every community alongside robust appeals mechanisms. It includes recruiting additional educational psychologists along with greater administrative support to allow them better use of their time, providing funding for the recruitment of 1,000 additional special education teachers and 1,300 additional SNAs on average per annum. Modernising and ensuring the needs of the individual students are at the centre of reform of the reasonable accommodation scheme with respect to state exams. Ensuring that the latest approaches to special education are included in initial teaching training and during continual professional development, and improving and reversing cuts to the summer programme and revising the allocation of special education teaching hours to include complex needs. Our manifesto also it contains a range of measures regarding housing and supported independent living for disabled people. Now, the housing strategy for disabled people was published in January of 2022, and as a 6-year strategy will reach its halfway point in January 2025, Sinn Féin believes that a comprehensive review of its impact to date would be timely. In addition to updating and extending the strategy, Sinn Féin's housing plan would make a number of immediate changes to ensure the housing needs of disabled people are met, such as ensuring that more than 10% of all new social and affordable houses to be suitable for disabled people, including wheelchair livability. We will require each local authority public housing delivery plan to include a detailed housing needs demand assessment, including an assessment of the type and number of new homes for disabled and autistic people required. Personal assistance services provide people with the opportunity to exercise control and choice in their lives. Now, according to the 2021 Disability Capacity Review, there is a substantial unmet need for pass. So it's recommended that by 2032, additional investment will be needed to provide for over 400,000 hours to accommodate demographic changes and begin tackling unmet need for PA services. So in government, Sinn Féin would double the number of PA hours to better address the substantial unmet need for these services while accommodating demographic changes. The Disability Capacity Review also noted that the level of home support provision catered for just a fraction of disabled people who experience difficulties with activities of everyday living. So Sinn Féin would deliver an additional 296,000 home care hours per annum. And we would further support care in the home by expanding the provision of intensive home care packages, which provides vital assistance for persons with complex disabilities and high support
Thanks,
needs.
Deputy. Thank you. Just over time there now.
Okay, sorry, I had
Thank
a bit on the cost of disability, but I can come back to that. Okay,
Thank you.
Michael.
Thanks, Deputy. Michal, you're very welcome. Our next speaker is Caroline Winstanley from the Social Democrats, and then we'll move on to Cinder Michal Carnegie. So my colleague Adrian is going to share the slides here, and Caroline will speak to the Social Democrats' position on the key topics that we're speaking of here tonight. Thank you.
Hey, hello, my name's Councillor Caroline Winstanley and I'm representing the Social Democrats. I'm not standing in the elections, but I'm standing as bringing a wealth of, I suppose, experience to the party. I've been practicing as a speech and language therapist for over 20 years and I come from a disability background. Next slide. So the Social Democrats have a disability plan or manifesto, and that explains how we support the rights of disabled people if we're in government. The full policy is an easy read. We've gone beyond the summary. So if you want kind of full detail of the policy, you can access it from the Social Democrats website. Next slide. In government, we would have a full Minister for Disability who will make sure that everyone is working together. We think that that's a big problem at the moment, that not enough people are working together, and that we're following the UNCRPD. We would facilitate greater consultation with DPOs, and we would ensure that more funding for DPOs so that they can involve in the political policy-making process from much earlier stages than they are at the moment. Next slide. Education. In Ireland, every person should be able to reach their full potential, and this can only happen with a well-resourced, modern and inclusive education system. Next slide. Many children do not have the support they need at school, and many children do not have the right school place. Next slide. We will give money to make a plan for inclusive schools, and we work on education policy to make sure that it actually follows the UNCRPD. We will make sure that there is person-centred rules about seclusion and restraint. Next slide. We will give money for a PA service to help disabled students who take part in education. We will develop more training about additional needs and teacher training, including autism-specific training. We will increase the number of SNAs in schools and make sure that their working conditions are better, so that will include pay and continued access to training. Next slide. An important part of our policy as well is that no children should be without assistive technology, and we think that this is a real barrier for some children to access their education, and we will increase money for therapies to be delivered in schools. We think it's important that organisations like Bookstore Ireland have more funding so that we can provide resources for vision impaired students, and we want to start the planning for July provision much earlier so that everyone gets what they need. Next slide. And we think it's really important to give more jobs to educational psychologists so that we have a much more thorough service. And we want to make sure all the buildings, school buildings, are accessible. So that's not just the buildings themselves through universal design, but also access to transport to school. Next slide. We will look at all social welfare payments to make sure that disabled people have enough money, and we will create a way for disabled people to get out of poverty. Next slide. Disabled people often live in poverty, and there must be a cost of disability payment. And as a party, we have been asking for this for quite a number of years now. Disabled people have more costs because of their disability. And what we're saying is that people should be getting at least €30 extra a week, but that would increase depending on their needs. So if they had more kind of complex needs and needed more equipment, then that rate of money would increase to meet their needs. Next slide. We believe family carers are also important. We will look at who can get the carers allowance, and we will want to see that more people can get it. And we will increase the amount of pay that carers get. I think people don't realise how much carers save the government on money with unpaid help. We will make sure that carers can also access the fuel allowance. Next slide. Having a place to live is a basic human right, and there's not enough social and affordable housing in Ireland. We will set a minimum target for social housing for disabled people, and that will be kind of dependent on where they live. So we will have an audit in areas so that we can make sure individual areas meet people's needs. And we will make sure that there's more wheelchair accessible housing. Next slide. We will have rules about who has the right to home care, and we'll have money for a person-centred home care scheme, including respite services. Disabled people should have access to services wherever they live in the country. We will give more money to for more personal assistance. Next slide.
Caroline, just to note that you're just over 4 minutes.
Okay. I think this is the last slide. Home care assistants should have a living wage. We will make sure that there's enough money to keep under 65s out of nursing homes. We will make sure that disabled people will get personalised budgets if they want, and we'll make it easier for people to get money for housing improvements.
That's great. Thanks.
Thank you for being patient with me then.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks for setting out the Social Democrats' position on the key policy areas. Thank you, Micheál Carnegie. You have 4 minutes to set out Fine Gael's position, and you're very welcome. And I know you had some tech issues from the outset, but you're with us now, which is the main thing. So I'm going to hand over to yourself, and like the rest of the candidates and representatives, you have 4 minutes.
Thanks very much, Michael. Thanks very much, and apologies for being in late. Tried a number of different devices, so finally managed to get on a different one here at home. So as I say, once again, apologies. Well, the key points in the Fine Gael manifesto, and I just want to highlight just a couple of things prior to on taking office. The Taoiseach set up a cabinet subcommittee on disabilities encompassing representatives from various government departments, a committee that he chairs himself, to push on and I suppose take out the silos that are there, and is one of the reasons why a lot of things aren't done in the disability sector. And indeed, the appointment of Minister Hildegard Naughton as Chief Whip to special education, we have somebody at cabinet that is actually working in special education. So I think there are two very prominent points just to highlight. With regards to disability, we want to make disability supports priority for the delivery of healthcare. We're looking to increase capacity and to enhance access so that disability services can be delivered in a timely manner. And one of the ways of doing this is, we want to increase the number of college places in the vital therapies, and indeed the number of therapy posts. We've started that over the last 2 years, but Minister Harris in further and higher education, and indeed Minister O'Donovan, where we increased those therapy places both here in the south and having a number of places in Northern Ireland. We're looking to expand residential places, day service places, and indeed the respite services throughout the country. And with regard to the cost of disability, we're looking at introducing a permanent cost of disability payment beginning with €500 and increasing the weekly disability allowance to €300 over the lifetime of the government. In education, we're looking to provide dedicated therapy services in schools, starting straight away with special schools and indeed special classes. We want to develop a common application system beginning with special schools to allow parents make an application to a number of schools through a central portal, meaning they'll only need to provide the child's details once and cut out these situations where we have parents applying to up to 20 to 30 schools looking for a place. We're looking to increase the number of therapists, as I said, and indeed the number of special education teachers, and we want to hold a citizens' assembly on education. With regard to independent living, the Action Plan for Disability 2024-26 is something that Fine Gael is committed to implicating, and it contains several measures which support independent living. We're looking to have more personal assistance and home support hours, and we have that in our manifesto. We're looking to increase the grant limits for housing adaptation grants We're looking at adding third level personal assistance, in the third level courses, and indeed expanding the number of courses that are available to those in university, including access to SUSI. So as you can see, there's a comprehensive role, area within disabilities that Fine Gael is looking to implement, and I suppose key to that, and it's something as chairman of the Joint Directors Committee on autism, was the reviewing of the Disability Act. I think it's something that's causing a massive amount of concern, and it's something that's contained within our manifesto, that we would look at reviewing the Disability Act. So thank you.
Thanks, Micheál. Bang on time. I didn't have to interject. So that's the second part of tonight's proceedings to our community members. The next session, we're going to put the questions that have been submitted by our community members to each of the representatives on the panel tonight. But before that, I just want to remind people that my colleague Adrian has shared a survey in our group, and we would appreciate if those that are on the call this evening could fill out that survey, basically capturing our community members' experience over the last 3 weeks with their engagement with candidates as the election campaign went underway. So the first topic that we're going to touch upon tonight within the Q&A session is on education, and I myself am going to put the questions to the candidates. As I said from the outset, each candidate will have 2 to 3 minutes to respond to each of the questions, and then once the education section is finished, then I'll hand you over to Derval and Tomas from Inclusion Ireland, who will chair the remaining 2 sessions. So we will get underway, and I suppose we know many of our children and young people, and Derval picked up with this at the outset, are bussed out of our communities to go to schools that are oftentimes 50, 60, 70 kilometers away from their household and from their community. We also know that a number of our families across both organizations are waiting to access key services through the CDNT teams, key supports in speech and language, occupational therapy, and psychology. And we know that having access to those supports at an early stage allows someone to progress on. We also know that by not having access to such supports, it can impact on an individual's engagement in all aspects of their life, particularly their education system, particularly the education system, and their vindicating of their right to an inclusive and an appropriate education. Niamh in Galway's question is, what would your party do to facilitate autistic children and children with an intellectual disability to go to a mainstream local school in line with their capacity and preference, and in line with Article 24 of the UNCRPD, and ensure they have the necessary supports? So I'm going to start as we began and pass that question over to Deputy Michael Moynihan.
Yes, the challenges that are being faced, I suppose, for kids with autism to attend their local schools. A lot of the primary schools have stepped up to the mark and have engaged and have built the services around their schools, and some of the communities are very, very proactive. But I personally believe that if there is money being spent by the department on extensions, or by putting new schools in places, that the money should not be granted unless the schools are going to have facilities, and have, I suppose, facilities to ensure that people with autism can attend this. In my own personal circumstance, we drive 34 minutes each day to have a suitable place for our son. And that puts huge challenges on everybody, But I think the fundamental point is that schools, both primary schools and secondary schools, should have, at this point, we ensure that facilities are available in every single community, be they urban or rural communities. The primary schools, I'd have to say, have by and large stepped up to the mark. A lot of work needs to be done into the future. But the second level schools, there is a massive challenge there, a massive challenge that the state, the government, have to make a very defined policy decision that all secondary schools have to provide places within their schools and facilities within their schools to integrate people with autism into the schools. And until that is the whether they're private schools, whether they're board of managements, whether they're VEC school or ETB schools, that all of them have to step up to the mark, because we have a serious challenge for families as they face into second level education, and they're distraught because they're a year or a year and a half trying to fight for a place for their kids, and it simply isn't good enough at the moment. So I suppose to ask the question, I believe there has to be defined policy in relation to ensuring that all schools step up to the mark.
Thanks, Deputy. I might put that question to yourself, Micheál.
But I would agree with Michael there. I think there needs to be a policy put in place that every single school across the country puts and has, you know, special education classes, both primary and post-primary. The reality is we need to get to a situation where every child is able to access education in their own community and allow every child to reach their full potential. And unfortunately, that is not the case at present. I know I personally had situations in my own county where we had to threaten, you know, certain legal sections for actually an extra special class to be opened up, where a number of parents had made an application and were being told that there wasn't places available, and then NCE had to get involved to make sure that an additional class, where there was a capacity for that class, was opened so that that child was able to access education. But we need to, and as I said earlier on, we need to get to a situation where every single school has the supports in place. As I said, we want to get to a situation where we have, you know, the school inclusion model, which is something that we had in the programme for government, and there was a trial done in, I think it was CHO Area 7, and it's proved very successful, where we have the therapists coming into the school on a weekly basis. And as I said, that's where we need to get to a situation where we have a significant number of therapists in place, hired by the NCSE, and coming into the schools and given the support. But we have a situation ahead of us where we actually haven't sufficient special classes in the post-primary schools at present to cater for the number of pupils that are coming from the primary system. And I think that has to be a priority in the coming months. And I know that direction was given by the Minister for Special Education that all the CNOs now are making contact, and I know the NCSE are asking parents to contact them to identify that they're going to have a need in the years ahead, so that we'll actually get to a situation where we have enough places in the post-primary system so that every child is able to access a place in the post-primary system.
Thanks, Micheál. And Deputy O'Costiga, I might put that question to yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think Cathal touched on this, the need for real and appropriate data. When I put the question to the Department of Education Forward Planning Unit at the Joint Oireachtas Committee, they weren't able to tell me the instance rate that they plan on. These things on a population-wide basis are predictable. We should have a clear idea across the country how many special education places we think that we need. And this speaks to the need for a strategic plan. And I think for the idea of having that proper citizens' assembly on education. We should be able to predict the need. And we should, from that point out, be able to say, well, we need this number of special school placements, we need this number of special classrooms, and we need this number of supported places within our mainstream classrooms. I would like to see the Department of Education getting far more involved in that and really improving our forward planning. Both Michael and Micheál have identified the problem that's there around the transition from primary into secondary school, whereas the primary schools have forged ahead and there's still a lot more work to do. The secondary schools haven't gone as far as quickly, and that's something that we absolutely need to address. But I referred to this earlier when I talked about teacher training and teacher education and continuing professional development. And I know within my own practice as a teacher, I really learned about how to deliver education, particularly within a mainstream setting where maybe somebody was coming in and out of the classroom or remaining within the classroom with support. I learned a lot of that in the job, and I think we have to get back both as continuing professional development and in initial teacher training to really concentrate on developing those skills in our teacher population. So we need the physical context to be right, so that we actually have the physical places within communities, the appropriate settings. But we also need to work on the context, with the soft context within our classroom, to make sure that our teachers and our special needs assistants have a really deep understanding of how best to deliver an education to somebody with special or additional needs, be that autism or be it something else. So that's a place where I'd really like to see investment going. My sense is that the teachers that are out there are very much up for that job. They're in teaching because they're passionate about teaching, and they want to know how to deliver on that promise to educate our children as best as they can. So that's the, I suppose, the two areas where I'd like to see priority given.
Thanks, Mark. And I know both from ourselves and AsIAM and indeed Inclusion Ireland, we know that there are many great teachers out there and SNAs who are doing a great job day in, day out. Cathal, I might come to yourself to get your the Labour Party's position on that question.
Yeah, I suppose taking that up, I think it does go back to, so firstly, in terms of workforce planning, in terms of access to therapies and assessments. So I think we can make policy changes and improvements in the education itself, but if we don't get the overall budget and public service planning provision right, and this goes back to the annual budget. So I mean, in terms of the policy development that I do in the party, we produce an annual budget, alternative budget every year, trying to get the costings, for example, out of the Department of Education in terms of what is the additional requirement next year for, in terms of capital investment, the additional number of staff that need to be hired, whether it's special needs assistants, special education teachers, just trying to get that information out of them in October when they're already preparing it for the budget. Or should be. That's why we believe that we need to change the entire budget system, that in early summer you would have departments producing what we would call an annual resourcing statement in terms of, here is actually what's going to be required 6 months in advance for the year ahead. And that's about changing, having that long-term perspective. And look, one of the key things, obviously, the EPSIN Act obviously needs to be updated as well. And it's been a long, drawn-out process. There's a number of legislative changes that need to be made. Final point I just would make is that even then, when a child does get an appropriate place, there is a huge staffing recruitment crisis within the education system, and this goes back to the overall picture around housing and cost of living. And so we have situations where there are a shortage of teachers, so special education teachers are being pulled into mainstream classes, and that undermines the quality of education for all children within the school settings. And speakers before me touched on the transition to second level, and then even into further work training and further on higher education, in terms of the supports drop off a cliff. But we'd be firmly our view is the long-term planning issue and resourcing that needs to be addressed, and then obviously the crisis, and then that will cut out a lot of the travel costs. So the amount of money, for example, that's being spent having to transport children long distances because they don't have an appropriate place in their local school. And that would, again, the savings that we make there, if they're actually invested into frontline education.
Great, thanks, Cathal. And Pauline, we might get Sinn Féin's position on that question.
Thanks, Michael. Well, I believe that the CDNT model is not working. It was established under Progressing Disabilities to replace the early intervention and the child development teams. I know that they worked sporadically. Some teams were better than the other, but the CDNTs, I think, across the board are not working. If Sinn Féin were in government, we would initiate an independent review into the CDNTs. I feel strongly that therapies need to go back into the special schools. In fact, they should never have been removed. They're very beneficial to both students and staff. So I know it's been talked about bringing them back in on a pilot basis, and I don't understand why there's a need for a pilot, because they did exist before. But I just think not into just the special schools, but also into other schools, starting with schools with a special class or an autistic class attached to them. Because otherwise you would encourage too many pupils to go to special classes or to special schools that may not require a special school. That's already happening because of the lack of trained staff within autistic classes in mainstream primary schools. And I think there should be joined up thinking that the therapy should be provided in school, but also with a combined approach from the community, so that any children or their families that needed the extra support in the community could get that, and then that those therapists would go on to provide the summer provision programme on a much wider basis than is currently being provided. I also feel that the NCSE needs to be resourced better. They were initiating a mapping project where they would map where, you know, school places were required. I don't know what has happened to that, because we're still finding ourselves in a position where there are many children who are leaving primary school, going to secondary school, and there's no appropriate school placement for them in their community. I actually think it has to go earlier. It has to go that we have a joined up thinking between preschool, and especially children who are accessing AIMS, into the primary school and into the secondary school, and that there are appropriate school placements for everybody, that there are more seniors employed, that the senior becomes familiar with the children and their families. There was a time when I dealt with a senior who was responsible for the school where I taught, and she knew every child who had an additional educational need in her area. She was in constant contact with their families. I talk to families now and I say to them, have you talked to your senior? They say, who's that? So I don't think it's good enough. I know there's an increased number of children with autism in particular, but then we need to increase the number of seniors to match that.
Thanks, Deputy. Last on this question, I'm going to hand over to Caroline Winstonley to set out the Social Democrats' position on that particular question.
Thank you. I suppose, first of all, there needs to be a culture and policy shift. As a party, we believe that we should be working towards a model where all children attend school together. So there needs to be a significant piece of work, I suppose, because all policy at the moment doesn't lend itself to that kind of culture and that way of thinking. So we would be looking at, firstly, at revising the ESPN Act in line with the UNCRPD. So we would want to see over a period of 15 years that we work towards not having a segregated education anymore. So this review would have to reflect modern understanding of disability and include kind of best practice and proper consultation with everyone involved. And any work done has to be properly resourced. We would also fund the rollout of the NCSE's Inclusive Education for an Inclusive Society, and conduct a full review of the Department of Education's guidelines for students with disabilities in line with the UNCRPD. I think all of that piece of work needs to be done before we can really properly provide a appropriate school place for a child. And then once we've kind of got the children in the appropriate setting, we need to make sure it's properly resourced. We need to make sure that the staff have the right training to, I suppose, meet the needs of everyone in their class and feel that they have those expertise and that they can do their job. We want to restore complex needs, the allocation criteria for special education teachers. We want to see an increase in SNAs, and we want to see that they're an improvement in their conditions so that they feel that they're appreciated and they want to stay in their jobs. And there needs to be like way more forward planning, and like we know early on the children in preschools and kind of what their profiles are, what their needs are, and we can be kind of planning way more in advance so that when kids are coming into the schools, that they come into an environment where things are already in place and set up for them, and that we're supporting and nurturing their development.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks to Niamh Galway for putting in that question in the first instance. We have one more question for our panel on this particular topic of education, and I suppose we know as organisations the sad reality that if you do have a child with additional needs, that your child is more likely to experience suspensions or restraint and seclusion in an Irish classroom setting. And even in AsIAM Same Chance report, which had 1,700 respondents engage with that survey, 12% of those who responded noted that their child experienced physical restraint in the classroom. And ourselves in Inclusion Ireland did a snap poll on that early on in the year, which had significant stark findings. I suppose that the question on this is from Chloe in Roscommon, and it's around how can we ensure our children are protected against the use of seclusion and inappropriate restraint in our classrooms. I suppose this is particularly relevant given the draft guidelines that are being developed by the Department of Education at the moment. And Michael, if we might go back to you on this particular question. You're on mute, Deputy.
I am getting just the last sentence there before you came to me.
So we're asking how can, this is from a community member, how can we ensure our children are protected against the use of seclusion in our schools and inappropriate restraint?
I suppose the vast majority of schools that I would interact with are very mindful of the challenges that are being faced, and those people that are working with people with additional needs are exceptional people, and they do great work. Of course, there needs to be, policies and guidelines in place, and updated the policies from a national, I suppose, nationally, the guidelines need to be updated, I suppose, not to make sure that everything is proved in a way that restraint and all that policies are in place. But I think, we are finding it fierce difficult to retain and recruit people who are to work within the disability sector, whether it's within education or whether it is within other sectors of it. And I think that we should be very mindful to acknowledge the great work that's been done at the moment. And we want to make sure that if we do revise the policies that are there and have them strong enough and robust into the future, that we'd also take into consideration the huge effort that individuals are making to work within the sector. And sometimes when we go about changing the policy or changing the regulations, it's almost as if that there is a slight on the people that are already working within the sector. And we don't appreciate enough the excellent people and the excellent work that they do right across, whether it's in education or any other aspects of disability. And we should acknowledge it at all times. We should acknowledge the work that they do. Whilst I agree, we need to update policies and we need to update in relation to safeguarding the individual, but we should not take from the great work that they are doing presently.
Thanks, Deputy. And I know you have to jump off at 8:30, so we thank you for your time this evening. I know you have a previous engagement. Micheál, I might put that question to yourself.
Thanks very much. I think, and something similar to Michael, I think first of all we need to acknowledge the fantastic work that is done by teachers and SNAs in our schools, in our special schools, and our special classes throughout the country. And it's I suppose it's a minimal where issues like these arise, but the reality is we're only at draft guideline stage, and we need to put in proper guidelines, rules, regulations, policies in place. And as Michael said, strong and robust. And where somebody strays outside that, it's unacceptable. I think that needs to be dealt with strongly. Their draft guidelines in a while. It's not acceptable, as I said, they need to be put in place and implemented in every single school across the country. And that's something I think that has been an issue. I think a lot of rules and regulations were principal led. It needs to be department led, the same across every single school across the country. And as I say, anyone that strays out from the strict guidelines that are put in place, I think needs to be dealt with strongly.
Thanks, Micheál. Mark?
Yeah, thank you. I think I've spoken to this before, really, in my earlier contribution. I don't think any teacher gets into the teaching profession with a view to engaging in seclusion or restraint. That's in no way, it's not an educational tool. What that speaks to me of is a teacher that can't cope and a teacher that's not been adequately supported. I think that children who are in the appropriate setting and have the adequate and appropriate supports, including basic things like the appropriate student-teacher ratio, or the support of SNAs within a classroom, be that in the special a special classroom where you'll have a 6-to-1 ratio, or in the mainstream classroom. But it speaks to me of a lack of appropriate support, because I know that no teacher wants to engage in that. That's not it's not a teaching method. It's a coping method. And so we need to better resource our teachers, both in terms of, as I said, those soft supports, the training that's in place for them to know how it is that they should be approaching individuals who have those special educational needs. I suppose the infrastructure around it, the support team that's around them, be that an SNA or a support teacher or the broader SEN team within a school, but also the physical environment as well. So that we have those appropriate spaces for the children so that they don't feel as stressed, so that they have predictability in their day, that they're still within their own community and with all of the predictability and safety and reliability that comes along with that. Those are the things that we need to get right, because we can take draft guidelines and turn them into full guidelines, and we can take a stick approach and penalize those schools that are engaged in these behaviors. But I know of no teacher that wants to use this as a tool, and I believe that if they're adequately supported, we won't see it used as a tool.
Will I come in there, Michael?
Yeah, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think in fairness, Mark has covered this quite strongly, and in fairness to AsIAm, I think you have quite detailed proposals in your manifesto proposals in terms of, I think, how this should be approached by whoever's in the next government. It's clear that we need guidelines. Look, there's a similar issue, similar but different in terms of the number of children, for example, that are on reduced hours in school, and it comes back to that point of child-centered, rights-based access to education, and again, resourcing of schools. So in terms of the resource allocation model, that the complex needs are taken into account, and it is important to note that this is very difficult for educational staff. There's a very strong campaign at the moment underway around assault leave provisions for teachers and SNAs, because teachers want to teach, and SNAs want to support their students, and we do need to look as well at the complaints mechanisms that are in place there, and how we ensure that both staff and teachers, staff and students and parents feel that their voices are being heard, and that the system works for everybody.
Thanks, Cathal. And I should say ourselves and Inclusion Ireland have been working on this topic extensively over the last number of months, indeed over a year now. Deputy Pauline Tully, I'll hand over to yourself.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, well, those draft guidelines need to be progressed without delay. I mean, they've been drafted for so long, it's years now, and I don't know, I can't understand the delay. I find, like, I've heard some horror stories, I'm sure, and I know you have as well, from parents of children who have been treated up terribly in school situations. I find while most teachers and management are understanding and try their best, some it is down to the management of the school and and the ethos that they impose. And I think there is a lack of training among staff, a lack of understanding of autism in particular. I mean, I taught in a school myself where there were many of my colleagues who did the utmost to understand the different conditions and how to address, anything that they encountered in their classroom, whether it be dyslexia or dyspraxia or, autistic children or whatever. But there were others who had absolutely no interest. So I do think there needs to be, there were some teachers who just wanted to teach the easy classes. Let's be honest. They wanted straight A students in their class and it didn't want to have an inclusive education and didn't want to differentiate their work. I've heard of teachers who use a sensory room as a punishment. Like you're not going to be allowed to go to the sensory room if you behave like that. That's a total misunderstanding, and that's down to a lack of training and awareness, and that needs to be addressed in a robust fashion so that all people going into the education system have an understanding of autism and an understanding of intellectual disability and neurodiversity in general. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. Caroline.
Thank you. I suppose fundamentally as a party, we do support legislation around eliminating the use of seclusion and restraint in schools. I think part of the issue at the moment is we don't truly know the extent of what's happening in schools, who's using restraint, who's using seclusion. And as part of that legislation, we'd want to see a sort of mandatory reporting of the same so that we can have a clear kind of picture of what is happening. I think it's really important to remember that behaviour is a challenge, that is a form of communication. The children are in distress, and it's I think it's very hard for schools without the proper training to know how to, I suppose, manage those situations. And I think, like, I wanted to give this example because I think it really kind of hit me home. So I work with a school, and they really wanted to invest in de-escalation training for staff so that they would never have to kind of reach a situation where they would have to use restraint or kind of seclusion practices. And it was the Department of Education themselves that stopped that school being able to access that training because they wouldn't give the teachers time off to complete that training. So I think that there is a whole systemic problem that we need to address there, but we would definitely call for it to be legislated.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks to all of our representatives for engaging with us on that particular topic. I'm going to hand you over now to Derval, our CEO from Inclusion Ireland, who is going to chair the next topic on disability, in particular supported independent living and housing and social protection. Derval.
Thank you all. Yes, so as Michael has said, I'll move into our next topic, and again, taking a human rights lens on this particular issue around housing for disabled people. So as we all know, there are many people are still living in congregated settings, in large institutional settings, in nursing homes who are under the age of 65, and at home with family members who are aging and who really want and should have a right to a plan for a home of their own, and with the adequate supports to move out into their own home. There are also many people on the flip side who want to stay living with their families, and this is what their families want too. But to make this a viable and real option, the state needs to fund proper support, whether that's personal assistance, home support, or personalised budgets. Yet we know that many people and their families get very limited supports, which leads to crisis situations time and time again, and people ending up in emergency residential care, in hospital, or in nursing homes. So we absolutely need to support people earlier and believe people when they tell us what they need to keep themselves afloat and to keep their families afloat. So my question to each of the representatives this evening is, how will your party ensure that there is adequate provision of housing and supported living for disabled people in the coming 5 years, and a real plan to support people to live in the community as is their right under Article 19 of the UN CRPD and as set out in the Disability Action Plan? So, Deputy Moynihan, I might go to you first before I know you have to leave. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And it is a very fundamental question, because making sure that people can live in their communities. Going back 20 or 25 years ago, community groups and organisations were equipped and were encouraged to be set up as voluntary housing bodies. And housing was, in a lot of rural towns and villages, housing was set aside for people with disabilities, and it was integrated into, maybe in some instances, into a larger housing scheme. But it was done at the time, and it was completely voluntary led, and it had a great impact on people who were able to get housing through that. There is so much red tape and bureaucracy after building up over the last number of years for voluntary housing bodies, that is not easy anymore. And a lot of the organizations that would have looked at it 25 years ago or even 10 years ago are now very reluctant to do so, because of the onerous responsibility that would be taken on to the directors of those particular housing bodies, which may have only maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 or 10 houses in their group. And I think that we have to go back to that. A lot of the innovative work that has been done to bring about a better quality of life for people with disabilities has been community led. And I think that we have to ensure that we have to enshrine it, but also, you know, in one of the reports that we wrote on the Disability Matters Committee was about housing and the insurance of proper housing. Housing is a huge challenge for everybody at the moment, but it is particularly acute for people with disabilities. And I think that we have to have it at the fore. I would love to see specifically that each house, the sheltered housing, for the want of a better word, that I was talking about, the voluntary housing bodies that were set up, that's a very good model. But it is important that we integrate people with disabilities into the wider community, that, there's all types of houses in a particular housing estate, and that there will be people with disabilities within that as well. And I do think that we have to look at what did work a number of decades ago and try and recreate it, or at least take the red tape and bureaucracy that has developed over that time out of the way, so that it is easier for voluntary groups and organizations to develop these housing bodies and to provide housing. There's also the grants that are available from local authorities to adapt houses. I think that they're, and some of the local authorities are extremely good at processing them, but I think that we have to have a greater, there is some changes to it, but I think there's more changes necessary, because if that grant was of such significance, it might help, to have housing or provide housing for people with disabilities. The other thing that I'm only saying this because I am going to have to hop off the line. The biggest challenge we have is where people with disabilities, intellectual disabilities, that are being cared for by their parents at this stage, being cared for by parents into their 70s and their 80s. And the state has not taken recognition of the lack of capacity that will be there to provide for people, in the decades to come, because their primary carers would have moved on, and then there becomes a crisis, and then everybody is talking about the family crisis. But we should be more innovative, and I think some of the service providers tell me that when a crisis is in, there's work being done by the HSE and others to avert the crisis. But we should be managing that to ensure that there is provision there, rather than creating a crisis, that there is a roadmap ahead for people. I only want to jump in on that because, unfortunately, I would have to leave the webinar. And I'd like to thank you all for organising this. And it is just because of another commitment I've had that I will have to go with it. But I think it is important that Inclusion Ireland and AsIAm and all keep talking about disability, because we have an awful deficit in funding, and we have issues that need to be addressed, and it's only by all of us who have an interest in it to keep banging the drum to make changes necessary.
Thank you, Deputy. I'll pose that question now to Micheál Carrigy next. So this is around both the options for people to move out of their family home into supported independent living, but also supporting people to stay living at home with adequate home support, personal assistance hours, as should be their right under UNCRPD.
Thanks very much, Dervla. And I think, as I said at the beginning, with the Action Plan for Disability 2024 to 2026, Fine Gael is committed to implement it, and there are several measures within that support independent living, and that includes, more personal assistance and home support hours. And with regard to actual housing itself, we're looking at promoting an increase in the maximum level of the grant for the housing adaptation scheme by 30%, and then increasing the income limit by 25%. But I actually believe that needs to be changed. Look, if someone has a disability and living in a house and is working as well, that should not be a precursor to them getting a grant for adapting the house for them to be able to independently live there. So I do think that's something that needs to be looked at. I think a lot of responsibility needs to go as well on our local authorities when we're given planning. And I don't know too many counties around the country, when a developer comes in or puts forward a proposal for a private housing development or a local authority development, are we building houses that are there ready, that could be tenanted by a person with a disability, rather than having a situation of someone taking up a tenancy and then having to apply for a housing adaptation grant to change it. I think that needs to be looked at, and every single local authority needs to put certain percentage or number of houses, while they're being developed when planning has been given, that housing is there, and as I said, available. With regard to, I suppose, being able to, we mentioned about third level education and personal assistance, and we're looking.
Seconds just to say before I move on. Thank you very much, Micheál. Yeah.
All right, sorry, no, I was just going to say
Go ahead, go ahead, yeah.
we're looking, at increasing the amount of personal assistance hours in third level to allow people, access third level education and be able to be supported. We're looking at expanding the number of courses, but you need to be able to access the SUSI system there to be able to live or travel or whatever it may be to go to school. So I think, as I say, a lot of responsibility is going to have to go on the local authorities when given planning, and that proper housing and adapted housing is in place. And as I say, we're committed to implementing the action plan for disability, as I say, where all these measures are in place to make sure, excuse me, that we support everyone to live independently.
Thank you, appreciate that. So I'll move now to the Green Party, to Mark, if you'd like to respond to that question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Derval. And I'll try to be as brief as possible because I know you're under pressure with the clock. I'll just pick up where Micheál left off. We have a commitment in our programme for government that will require 1/5 of new housing developments to meet universal design standards. That's a good idea both for people who are aging, and we're seeking to support them aging in place, but also for people with disabilities, and in particular physical disabilities. Some of the other commitments we have within the manifesto is to end the practice of under 65s being placed in nursing homes. It's completely inappropriate. It means that it just speaks to the fact that we haven't made adequate provision elsewhere and more appropriate provision. We want to support independence among people with disability by increasing the personal assistant hours by 300,000 hours. It seems quite a lot, and obviously we have to get the staffing right for that, but it will support that independence piece. We want to complete and evaluate the personalised budgeting pilot so that we've the pilot work done in that. We really need to complete that, evaluate it, so that we can roll it out more fully to support people. We want, as I said in my initial speech, we want to support and fund approved housing bodies. Michael talked about them as voluntary bodies before. We think approved housing bodies are the people now that should be stepping into the space to provide sheltered housing or the appropriate housing. And also, as Micheál referenced, we want to raise the upper limit on the housing adaptation grant as well, which is that piece about allowing people with disabilities either to remain in their own family home or to have the new home that they acquire, I suppose, upgraded so that it's appropriate to their need as well. So those are the main points I wanted to draw on from our manifesto. Excuse me.
Thank you. And I'll move on now to Cathal McGann from the Labour Party. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think we've all touched on that, the need for a ring fence set level of housing. I think if we need to look at the national housing strategy for disabled people, and we need to provide increased funding for technical advisors and local authorities to deliver on that. We also need to look at approved housing bodies, and many of the organisations in the sector have done great work in terms of the provision of housing, suitable housing either for decongregation or people with various levels of disabilities. A lot of approved housing bodies, though, are overgeared or overexposed, so we think we do need to look at the level of grants assistance that is available there. We've also proposed that we need to expand the role of local authority disability access and equality officers to make them full-time positions, give them appropriate powers and budgets, and that would be another way of driving that provision of at a local level, providing increased powers to local government, local councils to provide solutions to people in their communities, because we're not going to do this from the Custom House, you're going to do it at a local level. And then in terms of, Mark touched on the personalised budget project. I think most people across the political spectrum will want to see that expanded with a dedicated budget office, assuming that obviously the assessment works quite well in each regional health area. We all obviously support increased personal assistant hours and home support. There is an issue in terms of getting sufficient staff, and it's something we're very conscious of, that the terms and conditions for workers in the sector does need to be addressed. We essentially have a I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, a three-legged stool model where you have community and voluntary sector, you have HSE employees, and you have private for-profit services. We obviously want to see increased public provision. I think that's how you improve people's terms and conditions, but at a minimum, a joint Labour committee to set a floor in terms and conditions, because we can put the budget into the personal assistant hours or the home support, but if we can't get the staff, and in particular, if we can't get permanent staff, so that whoever is providing the service will understand the tailored individual needs of the person that they're helping, it's very difficult to get that supported living, because we can't underestimate the importance of the knowledge of the individual's needs and how critical that is. And if you have a constant rotation of different people providing that support, it limits the ability of that person to live independently.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm going to move now to Deputy Tully. Pauline, thank you.
Thanks, Derval. Well, I suppose we've committed that 10% of all both public and affordable housing would be for the disabled community. So that could be wheelchair, livable houses, or for those with intellectual disability, because I find that people with physical and intellectual disabilities are the ones who are longest on the housing waiting list. And usually you're told that that's because the local authority and the HSE don't work together. They don't have a planned approach. There have been improvements, I have to say, but often one is waiting on the other to do something, and or they use it as an excuse. So I'd like to see better planning around housing, and that's why we want to see an assessment led by a local authority, that they assess the needs in their community and provide the housing accordingly. Within our manifesto, we are providing for 3,000 appropriate residential placements for people who are in congregated settings or inappropriately placed in nursing homes over the term of the government. And then we will pledge 354,000 PA hours per annum additional to what's been provided already, and also 296,000 home care hours per annum additional to what's been provided already, so that people have the supports to live independently in their community, or if they choose, as under the UNCRPD, they have the right to choose who and where to live in the family home with parents. But we have too many instances where we're responding to a crisis instead of having a planned approach to the living arrangements for someone, as they go into adulthood and mature. And we also want to see people integrated into their own community instead of being placed in residential placements, which could be several counties away, several hours away from family, from friends, from whatever, maybe their day service, whatever they're attending. Thanks, Derval.
Thank you, Deputy. And I'll move finally to Caroline from the Social Democrats. Thank you.
So first of all, I suppose each kind of local area needs to review the number of people with disability on their list and what their needs are, and then set targets themselves for kind of what level of social housing that they need in their area. As a party, we would provide a statutory right to home care and a budget for a person-centred home care scheme with cross-country equality and access of availability. So this would include home carers actually having a living wage, so that they want to stay and do their jobs and they can afford to do their jobs. We'd also increase funding for personal assistance services as part of a move towards providing a statutory right to a personal assistance service for disabled people. We also want to see the end of institutionalisation for disabled people. Great work is happening. People are moving out into the community, but the process is so slow, and there's not enough funding there that as soon as people are moving in, more people are added to that list. There's just too much kind of fat in the process at the moment. Assessing what people need to move into their own accommodation is too slow. Just all that coordination piece is just needs a bit more kind of leanness, so that we're not kind of adding to the list as we're taking off. We want to ensure that disabled people who live at home with their families are supported to move into their own home, and that planning happens well in advance. We tend to find, because the process is slow and people are sitting on housing lists so long, that they come to a point of crisis, and then it's like, oh, where are we going to house them? Whereas if all the work had been kind of done much more timely, then people could move into a place at their own will and preference. And we would also create a comprehensive funding mechanism for personalised budgets. We see this as a way of moving forward for people, so they can move from institutional growth of home provision. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm now going to call on my colleague Tomás Murphy to ask a question around the cost of disability. If we have enough time, I'll come back in to ask a follow-up question on generally around social protection issues, but I'm conscious we're kind of edging into time at the moment. So I'll just hand over to Tomás first and we'll see where we're at that stage.
Thanks, Derval. In December 2021, the government published a report on the cost of disability in Ireland. It highlighted that disabled people face additional costs in their lives of up to 13,000 per year. Is your party committed to introducing a cost of disability payment in the lifetime of the next government? So I'm going to start with Micheál from Fine Gael. So Micheál.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Yes, Fine Gael as a party, we recognise that disabled people face significant additional costs, and you've put a figure there of €13,000, and I know it's even higher in some cases. We plan to introduce a permanent €500 cost of disability support, and then we're looking to increase it in further budgets over the term of the 5-year government term. We want to reform the disability allowance to bring it up to at least €300 per year. And we're also looking at enhancing the domiciliary care allowance, and indeed extending the free travel pass so that all children receiving the domiciliary care allowance are eligible for the free travel pass. Just with regard to carers allowance, which is another issue that has been highlighted over the lifetime of the government, we want to introduce a new family care payment starting with €325 a week, to recognise the vital role that carers play in society. We also want to increase the income disregard to €1,250 for a single carer and €2,500 for a couple. And we plan to, increase these limits in each budget with a view to ending the means test by the end of the 5-year term of government and transforming it into a family carers payment. And we also are looking, the annual carers support grant, which is currently, I think, €1,800. We're looking to increase that to 2,500. So it's a significant package of increases being put forward by Fine Gael over the term of the next government.
Thanks, Micheál. Mark from the Green Party.
Thanks, Tomas. The short answer to your question is yes. What we've written into the manifesto is that we would have a €50 per week cost of disability payment, which falls a long way short of some of the estimates of what the cost of disability actually is. That would be a little over 2,500 per year. I think it would be a good start, and we could take it from there. We also talk about an annual payment of 3,800 in the case of a child with a severe disability. In the wider context, we're also talking, as I said before, about that basic income for carers. And I think that could be a really exciting prospect going forward. The issue of caring within our society is only going to become more important when we look at, so we're talking about disability this evening, but when we talk about our aging population and our demographics, we're going to see more and more people who are becoming carers within our society. And we are going to have to figure out as a society how we support that and how we make it pay and how we make it worthwhile for people. So I think that basic income or basic income guarantee or basic income is something that we really should be looking at. I think it could be a real positive innovation in the space.
Thanks, Mark. Carter from Labour.
Yeah, thank you. So as I mentioned at the start, we want to develop a new integrated single taxable benefit, and alongside that introduce a cost of disability payment that we would over time increase to at least €50 a week. We do think there is a particular issue with how the current, and this proposal for the integrated single taxable benefit came from Labour disability section of our members. But obviously if we were in government and introducing this, I think it would have to obviously be developed in consultation with DPOs and people with disabilities. In terms of other supports, there was a mention of the housing adaptation grant earlier, that we believe the approximate cost of works that we're hearing back is usually at least €60,000. So the limits needs to go up to at least that, and obviously it needs to increase. The income limits need to increase in line with wage growth. We've also proposed that any works on that scheme should be again done in combination with warmer homes SAI upgrades to address energy poverty, a particular issue for people with disabilities, and that the warmer homes, SEI warmer home scheme, should be upgraded to ensure that it includes the installation of solar panels and renewable heat systems, so heat pumps, so to provide that energy security for people. And then we obviously need to look at the employment rates of people with disabilities. Ireland is a total outlier in the EU on this. We will need to produce a new comprehensive employment strategy that is properly resourced this time and implemented. The last minister talked a lot about reforms on the wage subsidy scheme and the overhaul of the regional accommodation fund, the awareness support schemes. That they need to be radically looked at and reformed. You know, the funding that's required for assistive technology, and then the transport supports that would be there for people in terms of the long overdue transport support scheme. So in terms of that holistic overall picture of living standards, meeting the cost of disability, supporting people into work, ensuring that the system supports them if they are able to work, and that also into further education and training. There's a huge amount that we need to do in that space, but I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Pauline from Sinn Féin.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Yeah, well, we would be guided by the objective of ensuring that payments reach the minimum essential standard of living, essentially. So we're looking at higher payments for those on disability. We would probably hope to raise it initially anyway by €70 over a term of government, possibly more. We've committed to abolishing the carers allowance means test in the same period as well. We're also investing in transport supports for people, both public transport, making it more accessible, but also for grants for private transport options, like for taxis, but also for purchasing cars and adapting cars. And also, like the cost of disability, a lot of it is around people having to pay for the services that should be available in the community. So it would be upscaling the provision of community services for disabled people, such as the therapies that we were talking about earlier, not just for children, but also for adults within the community, and increasing those, and also investing in the warmer homes, a similar scheme to the warmer homes, but substantially increasing the investment to address again the energy poverty that people are facing within some of the poorest homes that are dependent on fossil fuel and so on, and upgrading those. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. And Caroline from the Social Democrats, please.
Thank you. And to be respectful of time, I'm just going to stick to the cost of disability payment rather than the whole manifesto. So in our most recent alternative budget, we proposed a minimum €30 per week cost of disability payment. I want to emphasize that this is a starting point, and that there needs to be a whole piece of work to see how we could have kind of staggered payments depending on the level of need within the household, so that we could really target the people that have really high costs because of their disability if they need additional equipment. We would be highly informed by the cost of disability in Ireland report, and we would ensure that a combination of the disability allowance and the cost of disability payment would bring people above the poverty line and to that minimum essential standard of living.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm going to hand back to Gerald with Mike. Gerald's going to take it from here.
I think we've pretty much run out of time in terms of questions, so I am going to hand over to Michael to wrap up the session for this evening. Thanks all.
Thanks, Derval. Thanks, Tomas, and thanks to our representatives for answering those questions. Just a reminder that my colleague Adrian has shared our survey in the chat there, so we would really appreciate your engagement with that. I want to thank our representatives from across the political parties for taking the time out from what is a busy period, but I also want to thank our community members from both organisations who have taken the time to be with us tonight, but also taking the time to submit questions. Just due to time restraints, we didn't get around to asking all of the questions or posing all of the questions to the representatives on the panel. What I will say is in the remaining days, both on our website and indeed Inclusion Ireland, we have questions that candidates can ask candidates as they're knocking at their door, for whatever candidates are knocking on the doors in the last couple of days in the lead up to the election. But I just want to wish all of our representatives who are contesting in the election the very best of luck. I know the last 3 weeks do certainly take its toll, knocking and putting the foot on the pavement and so on, but we just want to wish you all the very best, and we'll see you on the other side, whatever that looks like. And I want to thank Inclusion Ireland for co-hosting this event with us this this evening, and indeed my colleagues Liz and Adrian. But we're going to close out the session. It is recorded. It will be on our social media platforms and YouTube channel in the next 24 hours or so. And yes, so I'm going to close off the session and wish you all well. And thanks again, Gurmila.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Michael. Derval, thank you.
Derval and everyone else.
Thank you.
Ross.
Thanks, everyone.